Europe's five largest accommodation and restaurant markets to hit $418 billion in revenue this year. Combined revenues of the accommodation and restaurant markets in Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Spain, as the five largest markets in Europe, are expected to hit $418 billion this year, $132 billion less than before the pandemic struck. Five largest European accommodation and restaurant markets to earn $132 billion less in 2021 than in 2019. The second wave of the pandemic significantly cut down accommodation and restaurant revenues. Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Spain are the five largest markets in Europe. The accommodation and restaurant sector is still coping with the consequences of the COVID-19, more than a year and a half after the pandemic struck. Although bars and restaurants across Europe reopened in the last few months, the second wave of the pandemic significantly cut down their revenues, turning 2021 into another challenging year. According to the latest data, the combined revenues of the accommodation and restaurant markets in Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Spain, as the five largest markets in Europe, are expected to hit $418 billion this year, $132 billion less than before the pandemic struck. UK's accommodation and restaurant revenues $41 billion below pre-pandemic levels, twice the revenue loss in Germany. The German accommodation and restaurant industry, the largest in Europe, has been hit hard by the COVID-19 lockdowns. Unlike in some other European countries, the strict COVID-19 protective measures kept German bars and restaurants closed until a few weeks ago, causing huge revenue losses for the entire sector. The COVID-19 Barometer 2020 also showed Germans changed their opinion about the restaurants drastically amid the pandemic. Almost 50% of respondents stated they plan to avoid bars, pubs, and restaurants even once the restrictions are lifted. In 2019, the German accommodation and restaurant sector generated $106.5 billion in revenue, revealed the latest data. After the pandemic struck, this figure plunged to $81.5 billion in 2020. Although revenues are projected to rise by 6.3% to $86.6 billion in 2021, this still represents a massive $20 billion drop compared to pre-pandemic figures. However, as the second largest in Europe, the UK's accommodation and restaurant sector is set to witness even bigger losses. Statista data indicate that bars and restaurants in the United Kingdom are expected to generate $93.6 billion in revenue this year, $41 billion less than in 2019. Spanish revenues to plunge by 40% in 2 years, the biggest drop among the top 5 markets. The revenues of the French accommodation and restaurant market are forecast to remain 20% below pre-pandemic levels. In 2019, restaurants and bars in the country generated $118 billion in revenue. With thousands of caterers closing their businesses amid the first and second wave of the pandemic, this figure is forecast to reach merely $95.4 billion in 2021. Statistics show the French market is expected to completely recover in the next 3 years, with revenues rising to $125.5 billion by 2023. The Italian accommodation and restaurant market is expected to hit $88.7 billion in revenue this year, compared to $100.3 billion in 2019. However, a recent survey revealed Spain had taken the hardest hit among Europe's top 5 markets. In 2019, the entire Spanish accommodation and restaurant sector generated $90.2 billion in revenue. After slumping to $47.6 billion in 2020, revenues are set to grow by 14% year-wide to $54.4 billion in 2020, a 40% drop in 2 years.